Okay, so hi, I'm back, and I've just read Life and Death, essays by Andrea Dworkin. And I haven't read Andrea for a while, and I always feel shaken up when I do read her because the passion that she is infused in her writing for the women she wrote about and the women she wrote for is really very moving. And she's been so maligned in history and hasn't really taken her place, and may not ever take her place, as one of the great civil rights activists of our time. And the people she tried to give voice to were really the people that historically nobody wants to give voice to and still remain largely voiceless. So it is a wonderful reminder of who she was as a woman and a feminist and a writer to reread her periodically. But it also takes its toll because she is so evocative in her description of the suffering of poor women, and particularly women involved in pornography and prostitution. So I think it's good to, I guess, maybe address the way, to begin with, to address the way that she's been represented historically, which is, anything from a feminazi, man-hating, separatist, militant kind of feminist, which is really was an attempt to slander her very coherent and heartfelt defence of women who are exploited by capitalism and by the sex industry. And she certainly wasn't a man-hater. So one of the reasons I chose this book is because it has essays and chapters from other works that give a good overview of the different work she was involved in. And one of the early chapters is autobiographical. And in that she talks about her early childhood and her love, indeed, of the three most important men in her life, which was her father, her brother, and her second husband and partner of 31 years, John. And I have written some notes on the way she described them because she was so generous in that description. So she says of her partner, John, he is a deeply kind person, and it is through the actual dailiness of living with him that I understand the spiritual poverty and sensual stupidity of eroticizing brutality over kindness. Of her brother Mark, she says, when my brother died, a part of me died. I had a utopian memory of loving him, a kind of ecstatic love for him that was non-verbal, inexplicable, untouched by growing older. And probably most importantly, her father, Harry, she says, he loved my mother and he loved Mark and me, but especially me. I will never know why. He said that I was the apple of his eye from the time I was born, and I believed him. I did nothing to earn it, and it was one of the great gifts of my life. So she certainly has a great love for the men who were instrumental in her development of her understanding of intimacy and self. Particularly those who shaped her early life. She is, her brother and her father. But also she describes the other side of her early life, which was that she was raped when she was 9 years old, and she continued to be the victim of sexual assault and violence into her adult life. So her first husband was a wife batterer and abused her very badly, and she ran away from him at a time where there was no social supports or even really understanding of domestic violence. And in fleeing from that relationship, she lived on the streets and she worked in prostitution. So, it infuses her writing not just with a rational defense of women who work in prostitution or pornography, but also from her own experience, which makes her writing that much more compelling, really. So what did she do? She was a young woman in the 1960s, and she describes that pornography really came into public consciousness in a broad, way in the 1960s, and it was embraced by the countercultural movement because it was illegal, and it was for that reason that it was embraced. It was seen as part of a suite of anti-establishment sentiments that were held by the revolutionaries at the time. So this, included anti-imperialism, anti-war, anti-racism, anti-capitalism, and anti-censorship. But from that point, pornography, in her view, took a dark trajectory to become one of the most violent expressions of capitalism that eventually became the industrial selling of women's bodies and the complete sexual objectification of them. So in 1983, with another very accomplished scholar and feminist, Catherine McKinnon, she came before the city of Minnesota with a proposition to write an ordinance to amend their civil rights legislation to include the possibility for women who had been used in the making of pornography to claim in a civil tribunal, if they had been harmed by that experience, some kind of compensation for the harm that they incurred in the making of pornography. And when her and Catherine were drafting this ordinance, probably one of the most important things was that the city opened the process to public contribution, and many women came forward who had been involved in pornography and prostitution and described the ways that they had been violently injured and, in many cases destroyed by the industry. And that really created in a space in public consciousness to conceive of the ways that pornography was so destructive to women. Ultimately, that ordinance was challenged in the courts. So the city was willing to accept that and fold that into its legislation, but it was challenged in the courts on the grounds of censorship. And this is really where Andrea builds some philosophical arguments that are also very compelling. So she has a lot of kind of, brilliant synopses of what pornography is. One of them was, pornography is the mechanism that ties orgasm to subjugation. And another one was, freedom feels very different when you're the one that it's being done to. This was because she, did not accept the defense that to censor pornography was to censor self-expression, because she said that expression is an abstract thing. So it's a thought or an idea that someone undertakes as a way of representing themselves. But she said pornography is not abstract, it's not an idea, it's a fact that is performed on women's bodies. You can't have pornography without, the majority of pornography includes the use of women's bodies, and that the violence that is done to them in the making of pornography is not an expression or an abstract, it's a fact of their physiology, and that you can't take out that reality of the making of pornography. She also said that it's the types of things that are done to women in the making of pornography are things that under any other circumstances would be considered an assault or a violence. But it's because of the sexualization of it that it is excused from this accusation. And she says that this is part of the twisted and the cruel psychology, where whatever you do to a woman, and the more that you harm her, the more that she responds that she likes it. And this is, fundamentally perverse, that in these films, and also, what she has understood from her own experience of prostitution and from working with women who worked in prostitution or work in prostitution, that they are required to insinuate that they like being harmed. And she really sees this as something that is, very specific to the abuse of women, that other groups of people who are physically harmed are not required, if you look back historically at groups of people who are violently aggressed upon, they're not required to pretend that they're enjoying that, or that the more that they're harmed, the more that they like it. So she says that, she wrote numerous books on the subject, and they're all very kind of, the language is very abrasive and very forthright, because she's articulating something that is still very controversial. And one of the reasons that it's controversial is because it challenges the two strongholds of patriarchy, which is sexual entitlement and capitalism. And, the question that she says is important that comes to the fore. There's two questions. In, most of her work, she focuses on different areas, domestic violence. She wrote a lot about Nicole Brown, is that her name? The murder of O.J. Simpson's former wife. So she speaks a lot about domestic violence as well. But the fundamental question that she settles on is what comes first in society? Is it the sexual entitlement of males, or is it a woman's right to dignity? And, obviously she comes down on the side of a woman's right to dignity, because she said, there's a quote there, male liberals seem to think we fight pornography to protect a sexual innocence, but we have none to protect. The innocence we want is the innocence that lets us love. People need dignity to love. So, she poses this question, is male sexual entitlement more important than female dignity? And then she derives from that question another question, that if you look at the way sexuality is represented in pornography, the question arises, can men have sex with their equals? And she says that we don't really have, this question is yet to be answered. So, through her work, and she did, what she did was go and speak to prostitutes and women who had been involved in pornography and try and write their stories, number one. And she also, in her book, Pornography, just recounts the acts that she witnesses. And, in an interview that I heard her give a number of years ago, she said that she felt that she should have written a follow-up book to Pornography, but she was physically incapable of doing it because the cost to her of watching that sort of violence was so harrowing that she wasn't able to sustain herself to do that. The personal cost was too high. But she does say that her contribution as a writer is the fact that she has given voice to these women. So she says, I had the luck of having my books last a long enough time to reach women, not elite women, but grassroots women and marginalised women. Slowly, women began to come to me and say, yes, that's right. I used writing to take language where women's pain was and women's fear, and I kept excavating for the words that could beat the burden of speaking the unspeakable, all that hadn't been said during the rape and after, while prostituting or after, truth that had not been said ever, or truth that had not been said looking at the rapist, the batterer, the pimp, the citizen John in the eye. This has been my contribution to literature and the women's movement. And I really think, her belief in justice, not just, and her love for the women she wrote for, she really tried to make these women visible, so bring their suffering out from under the cloak of the labels that are put on them that makes what happens to them okay, and expose the rapaciously cruel way that capitalism will exploit poor women. And this is really, I think, the relevance of Andrea Dworkin to contemporary times, particularly, in terms of the furore about the failure of Hillary Clinton to be elected, and the broad accusation that that was a reflection of misogyny. Of course, there is, liberal feminism is important, and the equal representation of women in positions of power. It goes without saying that you do not have equality in a society where there isn't equality of power sharing. So that goal of liberal feminism to instill women into positions of power is good and true. But what Andrea was exposing was the fact that where the violence happens to women, it is compounded and indeed facilitated by capitalism and war. So the sexual assaults, violence, rape of women during war is, the UN recognises that as a crime against humanity, and the facilitation of the making women's bodies a matter of capitalist consumption is endemic to capitalism. And she says of, there is no women's movement if it does not include the women who are being hurt the most and who have the least. We have to take on poverty, not in the liberal sense of heartfelt concern, but in the concrete sense of the real world. So I think the difficulty with reducing feminism to the gender identity of someone who is not anti-war or does not have a strong critique of the way capitalism affects women is self-evident, really. And she says, I think she's very generous as well about liberal feminism because, the movement is so broad, and of course nobody can absolutely represent it. So she says of liberal feminism, I have talked at different times about how mainstream media feminists have been corrupted really by the affluence that comes their way and the attention. It's a kind of social wealth even when it's not a monetary wealth. It's a kind of identity that most women don't have any way of achieving. So if you're a professional media feminist, then you get lots of identity, which is a big gift, but it's also very corrupting. The women's movement always called on and involved women from all sectors of society, but I would say that a lot of the women who have been involved in the women's movement are on a quest for respectability. They want to be acknowledged as decent, whole, honest human beings. This is right and fair, but there are enormous numbers of women who are living in what amounts to slavery is not the right word, but a barely acknowledged kind of marginality. They too are human beings, and they are being used day in and day out by men in ways from which other women have some kind of protection. The women's movement has never had anything to do with those women until we begin to address pornography, which led to addressing prostitution in a real way, not in the liberal way of let's everybody have a good time and some of us want to be prostitutes. So I think what we can take from Andrea Dworkin is that there probably is going to be two, it is right to draw distinctions between types of feminism. There is a liberal feminism that is focused on a small group of women who are protected from the worst excesses of the violence of patriarchy. And there is a feminism that is speaking for and to poor women who have the violence of patriarchy expressed onto their bodies. So she's amazing and heartbreaking to read, and I love her. So I thought I'm just only going to do two more, and I was looking for another woman, so I thought I will do Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is a massive task. Incidentally, Andrea described her as a brilliant woman, but certainly no feminist. And then I would do Dr. Martin Luther King as biography by Cornel West, because he presents such a brilliant version. So, Andrea, thank you, legend. Next week, Hannah Arendt, and then Martin Luther King, and then that's probably it. Okay, thank you.